Leaving the service of Madame de Vercelli's nearly as I had entered it, I returned to my former hostess, and remained there 5 or 6 weeks, during which time health, youth, and laziness frequently rendered my temperament importunate. I was restless, absent, and thoughtful. I wept and sighed for a happiness I had no idea of, though at the same time highly sensible of some deficiency. This situation is indescribable. Few men can even form any conception of it, because, in general, they have prevented that plenitude of life, at once tormenting and delicious. My thoughts were incessantly occupied with girls and women, but in a manner peculiar to myself. These ideas kept my senses in a perpetual and disagreeable activity, though, fortunately, they did not point out the means of deliverance. I would have given my life to have met with a Miss Goton, but the time was past in which the play of infancy predominated. Increase of years had introduced shame, the inseparable companion of a conscious deviation from rectitude, which so confirmed my natural timidity as to render it invincible, and never, either at that time or since, could I prevail on myself to offer a proposition favorable to my wishes, unless in a manner constrained to it by previous advances, even with those whose scruples I had no cause to dread. My stay at Madame de Vercelli's had procured me some acquaintance, which I thought might be serviceable to me, and therefore wished to retain. Among others, I sometimes visited a Savoyard Abbé, M. Game, who was tutor to the Count of Mellerede's children. He was young, and not much known, but possessed an excellent cultivated understanding, with great probity, and was, altogether, one of the best men I ever knew. He was incapable of doing me the service I then stood most in need of, not having sufficient interest to procure me a situation, but from him I reaped advantages far more precious, which have been useful to me through life, lessons of pure morality, and maxims of sound judgment. In the successive order of my inclinations and ideas, I had ever been too high or too low. Achilles or Thersites, sometimes a hero, at others a villain. M. Game took pains to make me properly acquainted with myself, without sparing or giving me too much discouragement. He spoke in advantageous terms of my disposition and talents, adding that he foresaw obstacles which would prevent my profiting by them. Thus, according to him, they were to serve less as steps by which I should mount a fortune, than as resources which might enable me to exist without one. He gave me a true picture of human life, of which, hitherto, I had formed but a very erroneous idea, teaching me that a man of understanding, though destined to experience adverse fortune, might, by skillful management, arrive at happiness, that there was no true felicity without virtue, which was practicable in every situation. He greatly diminished my admiration of grandeur, by proving that those in a superior situation are neither better nor happier than those they command. One of his maxims has frequently returned to my memory. It was, that if we could truly read the hearts of others we should feel more inclination to descend than rise. This reflection, the truth of which is striking without extravagance, I have found of great utility, in the various exigences of my life, as it tended to make me satisfied with my condition. He gave me the first just conception of relative duties, which my high-flown imagination had ever pictured in extremes, making me sensible that the enthusiasm of sublime virtues is of little use in society, that while endeavoring to rise too high we are in danger of falling, and that a virtuous and uniform discharge of little duties requires as great a degree of fortitude as actions which are called heroic, and would at the same time procure more honor and happiness. That it was infinitely more desirable to possess the lasting esteem of those about us, than at intervals to attract admiration. In properly arranging the various duties between man and man, it was necessary to ascend to principles. The step I had recently taken, and of which my present situation was the consequence, naturally led us to speak of religion. It will easily be conceived that the honest M. Game was, in a great measure, the original of the Savoyard vicar, prudence only obliging him to deliver his sentiments, on certain points, with more caution and reserve, and explain himself with less freedom. But his sentiments and counsels were the same. Not even excepting his advice to return to my country, all was precisely as I have since given it to the pubic. Dwelling no longer, therefore, on conversations which everyone may see the substance of, I shall only add, that these wise instructions, though they did not produce an immediate effect, were as so many seeds of virtue and religion in my heart which were never rooted out, and only required the fostering cares of friendship to bring to maturity. Though my conversation was not very sincere, I was affected by his discourses, and far from being weary, was pleased with them on account of their clearness and simplicity, but above all because his heart seemed interested in what he said. My disposition is naturally tender. I have ever been less attached to people for the good they have really done me than for that they designed to do, and my feelings in this particular have seldom misled me. Thus I truly esteemed him game. I was in a manner his second disciple, which even at that time was of inestimable service in turning me from a propensity to vice into which my idleness was leading me. One day, when I least expected it, I was sent for by the Count de la Roque. Having frequently called at his house, without being able to speak with him, I grew weary, and supposing he had either forgot me or retained some unfavorable impression of me, returned no more, but I was mistaken in both these conjectures. He had more than once witnessed the pleasure I took in fulfilling my duty to his aunt. He had even mentioned it to her, and afterwards spoke of it, when I no longer thought of it myself. He received me graciously, saying that instead of amusing me with useless promises, he had sought to place me to advantage, that he had succeeded, and would put me in a way to better my situation, but the rest must depend on myself. That the family into which he should introduce me being both powerful and esteemed, I should need no other patrons, and though at first on the footing of a servant, I might be assured that if my conduct and sentiments were found above that station, I should not long remain in it. The end of this discourse cruelly disappointed the brilliant hopes the beginning had inspired. What? Forever a footman, said I to myself, with a bitterness which confidence presently effaced, for I felt myself too superior to that situation to fear long remaining there. He took me to the Count de Gauvon, master of the horse to the Queen, and chief of the illustrious house of Solar. The air of dignity conspicuous in this respectable old man rendered the affability with which he received me yet more interesting. He questioned me with evident interest, and I replied with sincerity. He then told the Count de la Roque that my features were agreeable, and promised intellect, which he believed I was not deficient in, but that was not enough, and time must show the rest. After which, turning to me, he said, "Child, almost all situations are attended with difficulties in the beginning. Yours, however, shall not have too great a portion of them. Be prudent, and endeavor to please everyone. That will be almost your only employment. For the rest fear nothing, you shall be taken care of." Immediately after he went to the Marchioness de Braille, his daughter-in-law, to whom he presented me, and then to the Abbé de Gauvon, his son. I was elated with this beginning, as I knew enough of the world already to conclude that so much ceremony is not generally used at the reception of a footman. In fact, I was not treated like one. I dined at the steward's table, did not wear a livery, and the Count de Favria, a giddy youth, having commanded me to get behind his coach, his grandfather ordered that I should get behind no coach, nor follow anyone out of the house. Meantime, I waited at table, and did, within doors, the business of a footman, but I did it, as it were, of my own free will, without being appointed to any particular service, and except writing some letters, which were dictated to me, and cutting out some ornaments for the Count de Favria, I was almost the absolute master of my time. This trial of my discretion, which I did not then perceive, was certainly very dangerous, and not very humane, for in this state of idleness I might have contracted vices which I should not otherwise have given into. Fortunately, it did not produce that effect. My memory retained the lessons of game, they had made an impression on my heart, and I sometimes escaped from the house of my patron to obtain a repetition of them. I believe those who saw me going out, apparently by stealth, had no conception of my business. Nothing could be more prudent than the advice he gave me respecting my conduct. My beginning was admirable, so much attention, assiduity, and zeal had charmed everyone. The Abbé Game advised me to moderate this first ardor, lest I should relax, and that relaxation should be considered as neglect. "Your setting out," said he, "is the rule of what will be expected of you. Endeavor gradually to increase your attentions, but be cautious how you diminish them." As they paid but little attention to my trifling talents, and supposed I possessed no more than nature had given me, there was no appearance, notwithstanding the promises of Count de Gauvon, of my meeting with any particular consideration. Some objects of more consequence had intervened. The Marquis de Braille, son of the Count de Gauvon, was then ambassador at Vienna, some circumstances had occurred at that court which for some weeks kept the family in continual agitation, and left them no time to think of me. Meantime I had relaxed but little in my attentions, though one object in the family did me both good and harm, making me more secure from exterior dissipation, but less attentive to my duty. Mademoiselle de Braille was about my own age, tolerably handsome, and very fair complexioned, with black hair, which notwithstanding, gave her features that air of softness so natural to the flaxen, and which my heart could never resist. The court dress, so favorable to youth, showed her fine neck and shape to advantage, and the mourning, which was then worn, seemed to add to her beauty. It will be said, a domestic should not take notice of these things. I was certainly to blame, yet I perceived all this, nor was I the only one. The maitre d'hotel and valet de chambre spoke of her sometimes at table with a vulgarity that pained me extremely. My head, however, was not sufficiently turned to allow of my being entirely in love. I did not forget myself, or my situation. I loved to see Mademoiselle de Braille, to hear her utter anything that marked wit, sense, or good humor. My ambition, confined to a desire of waiting on her, never exceeded its just rights. At table I was ever attentive to make the most of them. If her footman quitted her chair, I instantly supplied his place. In default of this, I stood facing her, seeking in her eyes what she was about to ask for, and watching the moment to change her plate. What would I not have given to hear her command, to have her look at, or speak the smallest word to me? But no, I had the mortification to be beneath her regard. She did not even perceive I was there. Her brother, who frequently spoke to me while at table, having one day said something which I did not consider obliging, I made him so arch and well-turned an answer, that it drew her attention. She cast her eyes upon me, and this glance was sufficient to fill me with transport. The next day, a second occasion presented itself, which I fortunately made use of. A great dinner was given, and I saw, with astonishment, for the first time, the maitre d'hotel waiting at table, with a sword by his side, and hat on his head. By chance, the discourse turned on the motto of the House of Solar, which was, with the arms, worked in the tapestry, tel fiert que n'y fue pas. As the Piedmontese are not in general very perfect in the French language, they found fault with the orthography, saying, that in the word fiert there should be no t. The old Count de Gauvon was going to reply, when happening to cast his eyes on me, he perceived I smiled without daring to say anything. He immediately ordered me to speak my opinion. I then said, I did not think the t superfluous, fiert being an old French word, not derived from the noun feris, proud, threatening, but from the verb ferid, he strikes, he wounds. The motto, therefore, did not appear to mean some threat, but some strike who do not kill. The whole company fixed their eyes on me, then on each other, without speaking a word. Never was a greater degree of astonishment, but what most flattered me, was an air of satisfaction which I perceived on the countenance of Mademoiselle de Braille. This scornful lady deigned to cast on me a second look at least as valuable as the former, and turning to her grandfather, appeared to wait with impatience for the praise that was due to me, and which he fully bestowed, with such apparent satisfaction, that it was eagerly chorused by the whole table. This interval was short, but delightful in many respects. It was one of those moments so rarely met with, which place things in their natural order, and revenge depressed merit for the injuries of fortune. Some minutes after Mademoiselle de Braille again raised her eyes, desiring me with a voice of timid affability to give her some drink. It will easily be supposed I did not let her wait, but advancing towards her, I was seized with such a trembling, that having filled the glass too full, I spilled some of the water on her plate, and even on herself. Her brother asked me, giddily, why I trembled thus. This question increased my confusion, while the face of Mademoiselle de Braille was suffused with a crimson blush. Here ended the romance, where it may be remarked, as with Madame Basile, and others in the continuation of my life, that I was not fortunate in the conclusion of my amours. In vain I placed myself in the antechamber of Madame de Braille. I could not obtain one mark of attention from her daughter. She went in and out without looking at me, nor had I the confidence to raise my eyes to her. I was even so foolishly stupid, that one day, on dropping her glove as she passed, instead of seizing and covering it with kisses, as I would gladly have done, I did not dare to quit my place, but suffered it to be taken up by a great booby of a footman, whom I could willingly have knocked down for his officiousness. To complete my timidity, I perceived I had not the good fortune to please Madame de Braille. She not only never ordered, but even rejected, my services, and having twice found me in her antechamber, asked me, dryly, if I had nothing to do? I was obliged, therefore, to renounce this dear antechamber. At first it caused me some uneasiness, but other things intervening, I presently thought no more of it. The disdain of Madame de Braille was fully compensated by the kindness of her father-in-law, who at length began to think of me. The evening after the entertainment, I have already mentioned, he had a conversation with me that lasted half an hour, which appeared to satisfy him, and absolutely enchanted me. This good man had less sense than Madame de Vercellis, but possessed more feeling. I therefore succeeded much better with him. He bade me attach myself to his son, the Abbé Gauvin, who had an esteem for me, which, if I took care to cultivate, might be serviceable in furnishing me with what was necessary to complete their views for my future establishment. The next morning I flew to M. the Abbé, who did not receive me as a servant, but made me sit by his fireside, and questioned me with great affability. He soon found that my education, which had attempted many things, had completed none, but observing that I understood something of Latin, he undertook to teach me more, and appointed me to attend him every morning. Thus, by one of the whimsicalities which have marked the whole course of my life, at once above and below my natural situation, I was pupil and footman in the same house, and though in servitude, had a preceptor whose birth entitled him to supply that place only to the children of kings. The Abbé de Gauvin was a younger son, and designed by his family for a bishopric, for which reason his studies had been pursued further than is usual with people of quality. He had been sent to the University of Siena, where he had resided some years, and from whence he had brought a good portion of Cruscantism, designing to be that at Turin which the Abbé de Dangeau was formerly at Paris. Being disgusted with theology, he gave in to the belles lettres, which is very frequent in Italy, with those who have entered the career of prelacy. He had studied the poets, and wrote tolerable Latin and Italian verses. In a word, his taste was calculated to form mine, and give some order to that chaos of insignificant trash with which my brain was encumbered. But whether my prating had misled him, or that he could not support the trouble of teaching the elementary parts of Latin, he put me at first too high, and I had scarcely translated a few fables of Phaedrus before he put me into Virgil, or I could hardly understand anything. It will be seen hereafter that I was destined frequently to learn Latin, but never to attain it. I labored with assiduity, and the Abbé bestowed his attention with a degree of kindness, the remembrance of which, even at this time, both interests and softens me. I passed the greater part of the morning with him as much for my own instruction as his service, not that he ever permitted me to perform any menial office, but to copy, or write from his dictating, and my employment of secretary was more useful than that of scholar, and by this means I not only learned the Italian in its utmost purity, but also acquired a taste for literature, and some discernment of composition, which could not have been at La Tribu's, and which was useful to me when I afterwards wrote alone. At this period of my life, without being romantic, I might reasonably have indulged the hope of preferment. The Abbé, thoroughly pleased with me, expressed his satisfaction to everyone, while his father had such a singular affection for me, that I was assured by the Count de Favria that he had spoken of me to the king. Even Madame de Braille had laid aside her disdainful looks. In short, I was a general favorite, which gave great jealousy to the other servants, who, seeing me honored by the instructions of their master's son, were persuaded I should not remain their equal. As far as I could judge by some words dropped at random, and which I reflected on afterwards, it appeared to me that the House of Solar, wishing to run the career of embassies, and hoping perhaps in time to arrive at the ministry, wished to provide themselves with a person of merit and talents, who, depending entirely on them, might obtain their confidence, and be of essential service. This project of the Count de Gauvin was judicious, magnanimous, and truly worthy of a powerful nobleman, equally provident and generous, but besides my not seeing, at that time, its full extent, it was far too rational for my brain, and required too much confinement. My ridiculous ambition sought for fortune in the midst of brilliant adventures, and not finding one woman in all this scheme, it appeared tedious, painful, and melancholy, though I should rather have thought it more honorable on this account, as the species of merit generally patronized by women is certainly less worthy than I was supposed to possess. Everything succeeded to my wish. I had obtained, almost forced, the esteem of all. The trial was over, and I was universally considered as a young man with flattering prospects, who was not at present in his proper sphere, but was expected soon to reach it. But my place was not assigned me by man, and I was to reach it by very difficult paths. I now come to one of those characteristic traits, which are so natural to me, and which, indeed, the reader might have observed without this reflection. There were at Turin several new converts of my own stamp, whom I neither liked nor wished to see, but I had met with some Genevese who were not of this description, and among others A.M. Mussard, nicknamed Reinecke, a miniature painter, and a distant relation. This M. Mussard, having learned my situation at the Count de Gauvain's, came to see me, with another Genevese, named Backel, who had been my comrade during my apprenticeship. This Backel was a very sprightly, amusing young fellow, full of lively sallies, which at his time of life appeared extremely agreeable. At once, then, behold me delighted with M. Backel, charmed to such a degree that I found it impossible to quit him. He was shortly to depart for Geneva. What a loss had I to sustain! I felt the whole force of it, and resolving to make the best use of this precious interval, I determined not to leave him, or, rather, he never quitted me, for my head was not yet sufficiently turned to think of quitting the house without leave, but it was soon perceived that he engrossed my whole time, and he was accordingly forbid the house. This so incensed me, that forgetting everything but my friend Backel, I went neither to the Abbé nor the Count, and was no longer to be found at home. I paid no attention to repeated reprimands, and at length was threatened with dismissal. This threat was my ruin, as it suggested the idea that it was not absolutely necessary that Backel should depart alone. From that moment I could think of no other pleasure, no other situation or happiness than taking this journey. To render the felicity still more complete, at the end of it, though at an immense distance, I pictured to myself Madame de Warens, for as to returning to Geneva, it never entered into my imagination. The hills, fields, brooks, and villages incessantly succeeded each other with new charms, and this delightful jaunt seemed worthy to absorb my whole existence. Memory recalled, with inexpressible pleasure, how charming the country had appeared in coming to Turin. What then must it be, when, to the pleasure of independence, should be added the company of a good-humored comrade of my own age and disposition, without any constraint or obligation, but free to go or stay as we pleased? Would it not be madness to sacrifice the prospect of so much felicity to projects of ambition, slow and difficult in their execution, and uncertain in their event? But even supposing them realized, and in their utmost splendor, they were not worth 1/4 of an hour of the sweet pleasure and liberty of youth. Full of these wise conclusions, I conducted myself so improperly, that, not indeed without some trouble, I got myself dismissed, for on my return one night the maître d'hôtel gave me warning on the part of the Count. This was exactly what I wanted, for feeling, spite of myself, the extravagance of my conduct, I wished to excuse it by the addition of injustice and ingratitude, by throwing the blame on others, and sheltering myself under the idea of necessity. I was told the Count de Favria wished to speak with me the next morning before my departure, but, being sensible that my head was so far turned as to render it possible for me to disobey the injunction, the maître d'hôtel declined paying the money designed me, and which certainly I had very ill earned, till after this visit, for my kind patrons being unwilling to place me in the situation of a footman, I had not any fixed wages. The Count de Favria, though young and giddy, talked to me on this occasion in the most sensible and serious manner, I might add, if it would not be thought vain, with the utmost tenderness. He reminded me, in the most flattering terms, of the cares of his uncle, and intentions of his grandfather. After having drawn in lively colors what I was sacrificing to ruin, he offered to make my peace, without stipulating any conditions, but that I should no more see the worthless fellow who had seduced me. It was so apparent that he did not say all this of himself, that notwithstanding my blind stupidity, I powerfully felt the kindness of my good old master, but the dear journey was too firmly printed on my imagination for any consideration to balance the charm. Bereft of understanding, firm to my purpose, I hardened myself against conviction, and arrogantly answered, that as they had thought fit to give me warning, I had resolved to take it, and conceived it was now too late to retract, since, whatever might happen to me, I was fully resolved not to be driven a second time from the same house. The Count, justly irritated, bestowed on me some names which I deserved, and putting me out of his apartment by the shoulders, shut the door on me. I departed triumphant, as if I had gained the greatest victory, and fearful of sustaining a second combat, even had the ingratitude to leave the house without thanking the abbé for his kindness. To form a just conception of my delirium at that moment, the excess to which my heart is subject to be heated by the most trifling incidents, and the ardor with which my imagination seizes on the most attractive objects should be conceived. At these times, plans the most ridiculous, childish, and void of sense, flatter my favorite idea, and persuade me that it is reasonable to sacrifice everything to the possession of it. Would it be believed that when near 19, anyone could be so stupid as to build his hopes of future subsistence on an empty phial? For example, the Abbé de Gauvin had made me a present, some weeks before, of a very pretty heron fountain, with which I was highly delighted. Playing with this toy, and speaking of our departure, the sage Bacchal and myself thought it might be of infinite advantage, and enable us to lengthen our journey. What in the world was so curious as a heron fountain? This idea was the foundation on which we built our future fortune. We were to assemble the country people in every village we might pass through, and delight them with the sight of it, when feasting and good cheer would be sure to pour on us abundantly, for we were both firmly persuaded that provisions could cost nothing to those who grew and gathered them, and if they did not stuff travelers, it was downright ill nature. We pictured in all parts entertainments and weddings, reckoning that without any expense but wind from our lungs, and the water of our fountain, we should be maintained through Piedmont, Savoy, France, and indeed, all the world over. There was no end to our projected travels, and we immediately directed our course northward, rather for the pleasure of crossing the Alps, than from a supposed necessity of being obliged to stop at any place. Such was the plan on which I set out, abandoning without regret my preceptors, studies, and hopes, with the almost certain attainment of a fortune, to lead the life of a real vagabond. Farewell to the capital, adieu to the court, ambition, love, the fair, and all the great adventures into which hope had led me during the preceding year. I departed with my fountain and my friend Bacchal, a purse lightly furnished, but a heart overflowing with pleasure, and only thinking how to enjoy the extensive felicity which I supposed my project encircled. This extravagant journey was performed almost as agreeably as I had expected, though not exactly on the same plan. Not but our fountain highly amused the hostess and servants for some minutes at all the alehouses where we halted, yet we found it equally necessary to pay on our departure, but that gave us no concern, as we never thought of depending on it entirely until our money should be expended. An accident spared us that trouble. Our fountain was broken near Bramant, and in good time, for we both felt, though without daring to own it to each other, that we began to be weary of it. This misfortune rendered us gayer than ever. We laughed heartily at our giddiness in having forgotten that our clothes and shoes would wear out, or trusting to renew them by the play of our fountain. We continued our journey as merrily as we had begun it, only drawing faster towards that termination where our drained purses made it necessary for us to arrive. At Chambéry I became pensive, not for the folly I had committed, for never did anyone think less of the past, but on account of the reception I should meet with from Madame de Warens, for I looked on her house as my paternal home. I had written her an account of my reception at the Count de Gauvin's. She knew my expectancies, and, in congratulating me on my good fortune, had added some wise lessons on the return I ought to make for the kindness with which they treated me. She looked on my fortune as already made, if not destroyed by my own negligence. What then would she say on my arrival? For it never entered my mind that she might shut the door against me, but I dreaded the uneasiness I might give her. I dreaded her reproaches, to me more wounding than want. I resolved to bear all in silence, and, if possible, to appease her. I now saw nothing but Madame de Warens in the whole universe, and to live in disgrace with her was impossible. I was most concerned about my companion, whom I did not wish to offend, and feared I should not easily get rid of. I prefaced this separation by an affected coldness during the last day's journey. The droll understood me perfectly. In fact, he was rather giddy than deficient in point of sense. I expected he would have been hurt at my inconstancy, but I was quite mistaken. Nothing affected my friend Bacchal, for hardly had we set foot in town, on our arrival in Annecy, before he said, you are now at home, embraced, bade me adieu, turned on his heel, and disappeared, nor have I ever heard of him since. How did my heart beat as I approached the habitation of Madame de Warens? My legs trembled under me, my eyes were clouded with a mist, I neither saw, heard, nor recollected anyone, and was obliged frequently to stop that I might draw breath, and recall my bewildered senses. Was it fear of not obtaining that succor I stood in need of, which agitated me to this degree? At the age I then was, does the fear of perishing with hunger give such alarms? No, I declare with as much truth as pride, that it was not in the power of interest or indigence, at any period of my life, to expand or contract my heart. In the course of a painful life, memorable for its vicissitudes, frequently destitute of an asylum, and without bread, I have contemplated, with equal indifference, both opulence and misery. In what I might have begged or stolen, as others have done, but never could feel distress at being reduced to such necessities. Few men have grieved more than myself, few have shed so many tears, yet never did poverty, or the fear of falling into it, make me heave a sigh or moisten my eyelids. My soul, in despite of fortune, has only been sensible of real good and evil, which did not depend on her, and frequently, when in possession of everything that could make life pleasing, I have been the most miserable of mortals. The first glance of Madame de Warens banished all my fears, my heart leaped at the sound of her voice, I threw myself at her feet, and in transports of the most lively joy, pressed my lips upon her hand. I am ignorant whether she had received any recent information of me. I discovered but little surprise on her countenance, and no sorrow. "Poor child," said she, in an affectionate tone, "art thou here again? I knew you were too young for this journey. I am very glad, however, that it did not turn out so bad as I apprehended." She then made me recount my history. It was not long, and I did it faithfully, suppressing only some trifling circumstances, but on the whole neither sparing nor excusing myself. The question was, where I could lodge. She consulted her maid on this point. I hardly dared to breathe during the deliberation, but when I heard I was to sleep in the house, I could scarce contain my joy, and saw the little bundle I brought with me carried into my destined apartment with much the same sensations as St. Pur saw his chaise put up at Madame de Wolmer's. To complete all, I had the satisfaction to find that this favor was not to be transitory, for at a moment when they thought me attentive to something else, I heard Madame de Warens say, "They may talk as they please, but since Providence has sent him back, I am determined not to abandon him." Behold me, then, established at her house, not, however, that I date the happiest days of my life from this period, but this served to prepare me for them. Though that sensibility of heart, which enables us truly to enjoy our being, is the work of nature, and perhaps a mere effect of organization, yet it requires situations to unfold itself, and without a certain concurrence of favorable circumstances, a man born with the most acute sensibility may go out of the world without ever having been acquainted with his own temperament. This was my case till that time, and such perhaps it might have remained had I never known Madame de Warens, or even having known her, had I not remained with her long enough to contract that pleasing habit of affectionate sentiments with which she inspired me. I dare affirm that those who only love, do not feel the most charming sensations we are capable of. I am acquainted with another sentiment, less impetuous, but 1,000 times more delightful, sometimes joined with love, but frequently separated from it. This feeling is not simply friendship, it is more enchanting, more tender, nor do I imagine it can exist between persons of the same sex. At least I have been truly a friend, if ever a man was, and yet never experienced it in that kind. This distinction is not sufficiently clear, but will become so hereafter. Sentiments are only distinguishable by their effects. Madame de Warens inhabited an old house, but large enough to have a handsome spare apartment, which she made her drawing room. I now occupied this chamber, which was in the passage I have before mentioned as the place of our first meeting. Beyond the brook and gardens was a prospect of the country, which was by no means uninteresting to the young inhabitant, being the first time, since my residence at Bossy, that I had seen anything before my windows but walls, roofs, or the dirty street. How pleasing then was this novelty! It helped to increase the tenderness of my disposition, for I looked on this charming landscape as the gift of my dear patroness, who I could almost fancy had placed it there on purpose for me. Peaceably seated, my eyes pursued her amidst the flowers and the verdure. Her charms seemed to me confounded with those of the spring. My heart, till now contracted, here found means to expand itself, and my sighs exhaled freely in this charming retreat. The magnificence I had been accustomed to at Turin was not to be found at Madame de Warren's, but in lieu of it there was neatness, regularity, and a patriarchal abundance, which is seldom attached to pompous ostentation. She had very little plate, no china, no game in her kitchen, or foreign wines in her cellar, but both were well furnished, and at everyone's service, and her coffee, though served in earthenware cups, was excellent. Whoever came to her house was invited to dine there, and never did laborer, messenger, or traveler depart without refreshment. Her family consisted of a pretty chambermaid from Fribourg, named Merceret, a valet from her own country called Claudinette, of whom I shall speak hereafter, a cook, and 2 hired chairmen when she visited, which seldom happened. This was a great deal to be done out of 2,000 livres a year, yet, with good management, it might have been sufficient in a country where land is extremely good, and money very scarce. Unfortunately, economy was never her favorite virtue. She contracted debts, paid them, thus her money passed from hand to hand like a weaver's shuttle, and quickly disappeared. The arrangement of her housekeeping was exactly what I should have chosen, and I shared it with satisfaction. I was least pleased with the necessity of remaining too long at table. Madame de Warren's was so much incommoded with the first smell of soup or meat, as almost to occasion fainting. From this she slowly recovered, talking meantime, and never attempting to eat for the first half-hour. I could have dined thrice in the time, and had ever finished my meal long before she began. I then ate again for company, and though by this means I usually dined twice, felt no inconvenience from it. In short, I was perfectly at my ease, and the happier as my situation required no care. Not being at this time instructed in the state of her finances, I supposed her means were adequate to her expense, and though I afterwards found the same abundance, yet when instructed in her real situation, finding her pension ever anticipated, prevented me from enjoying the same tranquility. Foresight with me has always embittered enjoyment. In vain I saw the approach of misfortunes, I was never the more likely to avoid them. From the first moment of our meeting, the softest familiarity was established between us, and in the same degree it continued during the rest of her life. Child was my name, Mamma was hers, and child and Mamma we have ever continued, even after a number of years had almost effaced the apparent difference of age between us. I think those names convey an exact idea of our behavior, the simplicity of our manners, and above all, the similarity of our dispositions. To me she was the tenderest of mothers, ever preferring my welfare to her own pleasure, and if my own satisfaction found some interest in my attachment to her, it was not to change its nature, but only to render it more exquisite, and infatuate me with the charm of having a mother young and handsome, whom I was delighted to caress. I say literally, to caress, for never did it enter into her imagination to deny me the tenderest maternal kisses and endearments, or into my heart to abuse them. It will be said, at length our connection was of a different kind. I confess it, but have patience, that will come in its turn. The sudden sight of her, on our first interview, was the only truly passionate moment she ever inspired me with, and even that was principally the work of surprise. With her I had neither transports nor desires, but remained in a ravishing calm, sensible of a happiness I could not define, and thus could I have passed my whole life, or even eternity, without feeling an instant of uneasiness. She was the only person with whom I never experienced that want of conversation, which to me is so painful to endure. Our tete-a-tetes were rather an inexhaustible chat than conversation, which could only conclude from interruption. So far from finding discourse difficult, I rather thought it a hardship to be silent, unless, when contemplating her projects, she sunk into a reverie, when I silently let her meditate, and gazing on her, was the happiest of men. I had another singular fancy, which was that without pretending to the favor of a tete-a-tete, I was perpetually seeking occasion to form them, enjoying such opportunities with rapture, and when importunate visitors broke in upon us, no matter whether it was man or woman, I went out murmuring, not being able to remain a secondary object in her company. Then, counting the minutes in her antechamber, I used to curse these eternal visitors, thinking it inconceivable how they could find so much to say, because I had still more If ever I felt the full force of my attachment, it was when I did not see her. When in her presence, I was only content; when absent, my uneasiness reached almost to melancholy, and a wish to live with her gave me emotions of tenderness even to tears. Never shall I forget one great holiday, while she was at vespers, when I took a walk out of the city, my heart full of her image, and the ardent wish to pass my life with her. I could easily enough see that at present this was impossible, that the happiness I enjoyed would be of short duration, and this idea gave to my contemplations a tincture of melancholy, which, however, was not gloomy, but tempered with a flattering hope. The ringing of bells, which ever particularly affects me, the singing of birds, the fineness of the day, the beauty of the landscape, the scattered country houses, among which an idea I placed our future dwelling, altogether struck me with an impression so lively, tender, melancholy, and powerful, that I saw myself in ecstasy transported into that happy time and abode, where my heart, possessing all the felicity it could desire, might taste it with raptures inexpressible. I never recollect to have enjoyed the future with such force of illusions as at that time, and what has particularly struck me in the recollection of this reverie, is that when realized, I found my situation exactly as I had imagined it. If ever waking dream had an appearance of a prophetic vision, it was assuredly this. I was only deceived in its imaginary duration, for days, years, and life itself, passed ideally in perfect tranquillity, while the reality lasted but a moment. Alas! My most durable happiness was but as a dream, which I had no sooner had a glimpse of, than I instantly awoke. I know not what I should have done, if I was to enter into a detail of all the follies that affection for my dear Madame de Warens made me commit. When absent from her, how often have I kissed the bed on a supposition that she had slept there, the curtains and all the furniture of my chamber, on recollecting they were hers, and that her charming hands had touched them, nay, the floor itself, when I considered she had walked there. Sometimes even in her presence, extravagancies escaped me, which only the most violent passions seemed capable of inspiring. In a word, there was but one essential difference to distinguish me from an absolute lover, and that particular renders my situation almost inconceivable. I had returned from Italy, not absolutely as I went there, but as no one of my age, perhaps, ever did before, being equally unacquainted with women. My ardent constitution had found resources in those means by which youth of my disposition sometimes preserve their purity at the expense of health, vigor, and frequently of life itself. My local situation should likewise be considered: living with a pretty woman, cherishing her image in the bottom of my heart, seeing her during the whole day, at night surrounded with objects that recalled her incessantly to my remembrance, and sleeping in the bed where I knew she had slept. What a situation! Who can read this without supposing me on the brink of the grave? But quite the contrary, that which might have ruined me, acted as a preservative, at least for a time. Intoxicated with the charm of living with her, with the ardent desire of passing my life there, absent or present, I saw in her a tender mother, an amiable sister, a respected friend, but nothing more. Meantime, her image filled my heart, and left room for no other object. The extreme tenderness with which she inspired me excluded every other woman from my consideration, and preserved me from the whole sex. In a word, I was virtuous, because I loved her. Let these particulars, which I recount but indifferently, be considered, and then let anyone judge what kind of attachment I had for her. For my part, all I can say is, that if it hitherto appears extraordinary, it will appear much more so in the sequel. My time passed in the most agreeable manner, though occupied in a way which was by no means calculated to please me, such as having projects to digest, bills to write fair, receipts to transcribe, herbs to pick, drugs to pound, or distillations to attend, and in the midst of all this, came crowds of travelers, beggars, and visitors of all denominations. Sometimes it was necessary to converse at the same time with a soldier, an apothecary, a prebendary, a fine lady, and a lay brother. I grumbled, swore, and wished all this troublesome medley at the devil, while she seemed to enjoy it, laughing at my chagrin till the tears ran down her cheeks. What excited her mirth still more, was to see that my anger was increased by not being able myself to refrain from laughter. These little intervals, in which I enjoyed the pleasure of grumbling, were charming, and if, during the dispute, another importunate visitor arrived, she would add to her amusement by maliciously prolonging the visit, meantime casting glances at me for which I could almost have beat her, nor could she without difficulty refrain from laughter on seeing my constrained politeness, though every moment glancing at her the look of a fury, while, even in spite of myself, I thought the scene truly diverting. All this, without being pleasing in itself, contributed to amuse, because it made up a part of a life which I thought delightful. Nothing that was performed around me, nothing that I was obliged to do, suited my taste, but everything suited my heart, and I believe, at length, I should have liked the study of medicine, had not my natural distaste to it perpetually engaged us in whimsical scenes, that prevented my thinking of it in a serious light. It was, perhaps, the first time that this art produced mirth. I pretended to distinguish a physical book by its smell, and what was more diverting, was seldom mistaken. Madame de Warens made me taste the most nauseous drugs. In vain I ran, or endeavored to defend myself, spite of resistance or wry faces, spite of my struggles, or even of my teeth. When I saw her charming fingers approach my lips, I was obliged to give up the contest.